I want to take a moment and thank all my patrons. Thank you guys for all the support. If you like what I do and you'd like to support the channel, you can support me on Patreon. I'll link it in the video description. Patrons get early access to all of my videos with no ads, and they get a few special videos that I do every week just for patrons with updates about the channel and a couple of other things. You can also support me in other ways by clicking the like button or subscribing to the channel. Both of those help quite a bit, so thank you guys. Welcome to the Twisted Tentacle Inn. I'm your innkeeper, and today we'll be talking about level 4 sorcerer spells. In this series of videos, we've been deep diving into every aspect of the sorcerer class. Check the video description for links to all the videos in the series, like my deep dive into the Metamagic options, where I discuss the uses, benefits, and drawbacks of each Metamagic option available to sorcerers. In today's video, we'll be discussing each level 4 spell in terms of function and intended uses, along with a summary of the Metamagic that work with it and which ones don't. I'll be using a bigger and more bright font for the Metamagic options that I recommend for each spell the most, and that'll be in the summary after I discuss each spell individually. At the end of the video, I'm going to categorize spells into groups, including the ones I highly recommend, the ones I think are not the best but still okay, and ones that will be good in specific circumstances, and the ones that I think that you probably should not get no matter what. So check that out at the end of the video, and there'll be timestamps in the video description as well. The level 4 spell list is small relative to the levels that came before it, but it includes some very good spells with just a couple of bad ones. Although very few are going to be game-changing, a lot of the spells can be used as replacements for lower level spells. This level also has a very focused group of spells. Most of them are offensive spells or control spells, or a combination of control and damage. There are only a handful of utility spells, and one of them is used for combat more than utility, so there's that as well. What this means is that getting level 4 spells can allow you to drop a lower level spell that serves a similar function and replace a lower level spell with a spell that you weren't able to get earlier in your adventuring career, and one that might help you diversify if that's something that you're looking to do. But the fact that level 4 spells bring very little that's new is a good thing if you picked a subclass with access to summoning spells, because you can completely skip over the actual level 4 spell list and pick up one of those summoning spells. Most sorcerer subclasses that get a summon get them at this spell level. In most cases, I'd recommend going with a summoning spell above any other spell if you're able to. Summoned creatures are really good for improving your action economy, your capabilities inside and out of combat, and they can help tank quite a bit of damage for your group. So summon spells are great even if the creatures don't have any abilities, but most summon spells summon creatures with extra abilities on top of all these other benefits. So it's a really big boost to your group, and I think summoning spells are going to be the top of the list regardless. Now, if you choose the Aberrant Mind Sorcerer or the Clockwork Soul Sorcerer, take a long look at the summon spell that you're going to have access to at this level, and then try to find a reason not to take it, because if you can't find one, then I highly recommend that you do take those spells and not worry so much about any others. I'm going to discuss the summons available to these subclasses in their individual subclass videos within the series, which will be linked in the video description as I release those videos. Now, this is a much shorter list than levels 1, 2, and 3, so this is going to be a slightly shorter video than the ones that I did for those spells. So let's go ahead and get started. Banishment. You force a charisma saving throw on a target, and if they fail, they're effectively taken out of the combat or the location for a minute. This can be used inside and outside of combat. If you're fighting creatures that are not native to the prime material plane, the banishment could be permanent if you concentrate through the full duration. If you lose your concentration part of the way through, those creatures do come back. Now, even if they're from the prime material plane, the spell takes them out with no additional saving throws afterwards, after the first one. So as long as you keep that concentration, those creatures are gone. And because the creature is incapacitated once they fail their initial saving throw, it can even allow your group to pack on some buff spells and healing potions on themselves, holding their final action so that when the creature does return, all the attacks get unleashed on the creature, and they're pretty helpless with all these buffed and healed characters attacking them all at once. So clearly the spell is going to be really powerful, since a failed saving throw is all that's needed to end an encounter with a single foe. This type of spell really isn't my playstyle, but I can't deny the power level of a spell like this, especially if you use the heightened spell Metamagic, which can really help in ensuring that the spell lands, and then pretty much that creature is done for. A charisma saving throw is generally more difficult for creatures to save against, and heightened spell is just going to make it even more difficult. You can extend the range beyond 60 feet with distance spell, which should be noted would make it long enough range where counterspell can't be used on it, since counterspell has a range of 60 feet. You can also extend the duration to 2 minutes with the extended spell Metamagic, but I don't think this is particularly useful. 1 minute versus 2 minutes is not a huge difference, but once in a while I'm sure that's going to come up, I guess. Upcasting the spell is really good because each spell level above 4th allows you to target an additional creature, which could be extremely devastating for combats once you're able to target 4 creatures with this one spell. I mean, that's amazing. Just take 4 creatures completely out of the combat. Very powerful. But even then, you don't have to wait so long. You can use Twin Spell, and Twin Spell is going to be really powerful. The only thing is, Twin Spell is going to cost you 4 sorcery points, which is a really steep cost. Now, if you think about it practically, though, it's a bargain, since once you can cast 5th level spells, you can save yourself a 5th level spell slot if you want to target 2 creatures. Instead of wasting a 5th level spell slot, you can spend 4 sorcery points, which is actually a bargain. It's cheaper resource-wise than having to spend a 5th level slot. This one is probably the strongest of the 4th level spells that you're going to have access to. Before we move on, I do have to take a quick note about components here. If your table is using material components and paying attention to what they are, this spell might have a major limitation that you may not have noticed. The material component is supposed to be an item that is distasteful to the target. Unless you know your target and what they like and don't like, this really could mean that the spell can't be cast on that target, or that you might fail the spell if you misjudge what the creature deems distasteful. My tables generally don't pay attention to components unless they have like a gold cost value, but it's something that some tables take very seriously, so keep that in mind if that's something that your table does. Next up is Blight. I generally hate single target damage spells. If you want to hit single targets, I think those things are better left for fighters, barbarians, and paladins. But that said, there are times where you're going to need to focus fire on one creature. Blight's damage is pretty good for a 4th level spell, but when considering the total damage of a fireball that it can, when you deal it against a large group of foes, the damage this spell does is honestly not that great. The stipulation with regards to using it against a plant is extremely situational, and I doubt that it's ever going to come up unless you're playing in a very specific type of campaign. I guess if you target just one creature, there's no chance of friendly fire, so that's an upside, but that alone is not enough to justify taking the spell. Necrotic damage is a very common resistance, and the range of 30 feet is frankly abysmal. Distance spell can really go a long way with this one, and subtle spell is kind of interesting since there's no material component, and empowered spell could really boost the damage to a decent amount. Charm Monster. I made a video for the Charm Person spell, and I'll post that in the video description. In that video, I talk about the best use for Charm Person being just information gathering. You're not using that spell to take control of someone. That's what Dominate Person is for. So Charm Monster is actually very similar in certain ways, But in other ways, it's actually worse than Charm Person. Even though this one is a higher level spell, it can theoretically affect more than just humanoids. But to be honest, you're not going to be getting much information from creatures that are not able to speak the same language as you. So targeting non-humanoids with a spell that's meant for gathering information is honestly a waste of a 4th level spell slot, in my opinion. I feel like it needs to be emphasized that this spell does not give you full control of a creature, nor does it make a creature suddenly hostile to its own allies. It doesn't see its allies any different. They're still its allies. It only sees you as a friend. It doesn't see your allies as a friend. So it's still going to attack your allies. All it does is it makes it friendly to you specifically, not your fighter, not your cleric, and it does not make it hostile to its friends. And then the other thing, it doesn't have to do what you tell it to. It has full control of its mind other than seeing you as an ally. The range of the spell is also really terrible. It's 30 feet, so distance spell can help a lot, but why waste distance spell on a spell that's really not going to do much for you? The duration of 1 hour means that the extended spell Metamagic can be used on it, but I guess that's going to be the best option for Metamagic on this one, but that I just don't see anyone trying to use that on this. Heightened spell can also ensure that this lands, and subtle spell makes it so that no one knows that you're casting the spell, but the creature's still going to know that it was charmed by you. So even with subtle spell, you can't get away from the fact that the creature is going to know that you charmed it. Upcasting this spell lets you affect multiple creatures, but I really don't see a reason for that to ever be useful beyond some very specific circumstances. There are very few times where this spell as a whole is going to come in handy. It can, I'm sure, but it's just not enough times to justify filling one of your very limited spots of known spells for this spell. Confusion. This one's actually a really good control spell. The range is really good, and even though on most occasions you're probably not going to need to go beyond the range that it has, distance spell works on it, so you can extend the range to 180 feet, which is awesome. The area of effect's a little small, but the impact on the battlefield is so good that we can honestly give a pass to the area of effect. Basically, if a creature fails their saving throw, there's an 80% chance that it does nothing on its turn, except probably move or attack its own allies. This is pretty big because a creature that does nothing is a major boost to your party in a combat, especially at higher levels where creatures can do a lot on their turns. And even better if those creatures attack their allies instead. Now you're getting additional damage output in addition to that creature not hitting you guys. That's a huge boost to your party's action economy, if you ask me. And even better that if you affect a spellcaster or a creature with special spell-like ability or that type of thing, those creatures are going to do nothing. They're going to move, or they might attack with a regular melee attack, like a wimpy punch or something, which is really awesome. Generally, I don't like spells that allow a save every single round, but the fact that you can affect multiple creatures is actually really good and makes the spell really good. Extended spell works on this, but you're going to be using this in combat, so you probably aren't going to need to use it. Heightened spell can be used on one of the creatures on their first save, but the save that they get every round is not going to be affected by heightened spell, as that usually works that way. Careful spell is honestly the real winner here, since you can cast this right into a melee and not affect your friends at all. So that's going to be the kicker right there. If you have careful spell, I would highly consider taking this spell and using it with this spell. Upcasting the spell makes the area of effect bigger, which is nice. I really like that a lot, kind of like Fog Cloud. I would definitely consider this spell. Next up is Dimension Door. Teleporting is a great option for tactics, and Dimension Door is one of the best spells for teleportation. With a 500-foot range and no requirement to see the point of your destination, it's far superior to Misty Step. Plus, unlike Misty Step, you can use distance spell to double the distance that you can teleport, and also you can bring a friend. But it's not perfect. The creature that you bring with you has to be willing, and it has to be the same size or smaller than you, which makes this one of the few spells that are actually weaker in the hands of a halfling or a gnome or another small race. I really dislike this limitation. I feel like it's an unnecessary nerf for gnomes. They could have just said a medium or smaller creature, and that would have been fine. But they had to go and say a creature of equal or smaller size, and that really makes me upset because I love gnomes, and if I use a gnome, this spell is going to kind of suck to not be able to bring the rest of my party members with me when I cast Dimension Door. But honestly, its biggest limitation is the fact that it takes an action to cast, where Misty Step costs a bonus action. Now, you can quicken spell and make it a bonus action, but that's going to cost you 2 sorcery points, which is a little bit unfortunate. Overall, though, I still think that the spell is great, mostly because that range is so fantastic. The fact that you don't have to see the point where you're teleporting to, and the fact that you can bring someone along with you. The range alone makes it far better for utility than Misty Step or Thunderstep, so I would definitely consider this if I'm not playing a small race character. Dominate Beast. Kind of like Charm Monster in a way, but it only works on the beast creature type, and it has double the range but a lower duration. The duration of 1 minute kind of tells us that this is intended to be a combat spell, but it can still serve a little bit of utility outside of combat. There's a couple of things that I like about this spell that still make it usable on far more instances than Charm Monster. First, and unlike Charm Monster, you can issue commands to the creature, which it will obey. That means that you can have it attack its own allies if you wanted to, and it doesn't even take an action for you to issue that command, which is a great boost to your action economy during a combat. Second, you can actually take control of the creature and force it to take actions that it otherwise wouldn't take. This one's a decent spell, to be honest, but I probably wouldn't keep it past 10th level since beasts become increasingly rare at higher levels. That is, unless you plan to capture some beasts on your own and then keep them caged while you rest, and then upcast the spell every morning. You can twin the spell, which is pretty cool because then you can dominate 2 beasts. You can use Heightened Spell to really up the chances of you getting the beast to be controlled by you. Even better, if you upcast this to 7th level, you can effectively have a beast companion for an entire adventuring day, which is pretty cool. You can capture a really cool beast and then keep it in a cage, and then after every long rest, use the extended spell Metamagic, wake up and go adventuring with your new animal friend for up to 16 hours. So who needs a Beastmaster when you're a sorcerer, right? And this is probably going to be a better beast than a Beastmaster gets. So why not? Greater Invisibility. This is a good buff and utility spell. For combat, this one is infinitely better than the 2nd level spell in Invisibility, since the person who is invisible doesn't become visible once they make an attack. Distance spell turns this from a touch spell to a 30-foot range, which really can boost your tactics in combat, especially if you cast it on a rogue or a ranger. But even better, if you're specializing in blasting, this spell can really keep you safe and you blast away everyone, especially if you use Subtle Spell on your blast spells while you're invisible. No one's going to know where those spells are coming from. Not just that, but the utility functions of the spell are really numerous as well. Again, Subtle Spell can really go a long way here. So I recommend this spell for sorcerers who are specializing in blasting or buffing. I don't recommend it as much for those specializing in control, since this one takes your concentration. Overall, a great defensive spell and a great utility spell as well. Ice Storm. I honestly don't know why this spell exists. It deals mediocre damage in a mediocre area of effect. The range is the only reason I can think of for taking the spell. 300 feet is kind of ridiculous, but I seriously doubt that you'll ever need to cast any spell even beyond 200 feet in most instances. An upcast fireball does more damage in a very similar area of effect, and I know that this creates difficult terrain, but it only lasts for one round, which is nothing, especially for this level spell. Come on. Why not cast Erupting Earth instead? It's a lower level spell. With extended spell, you can get a range that's very close to this spell's range. If you upcast Erupting Earth to a 4th level spell, not only do you get out more damage, especially if you use Empowered Spell, you're going to eke out even more damage, but also the difficult terrain lasts until creatures spend an action to undo the difficult terrain, and that's for each 5-foot square. So the Erupting Earth is a way better spell, and it's a lower level spell. Empowered Spell is going to boost Erupting Earth far more than this spell as well. Just take Erupting Earth and upcast it. Do not take this spell. Next up is Polymorph. This is one of the most popular 4th level spells in the game. Polymorph does have a lot going for it. I've never actually taken this spell, to be honest, because again, this type of thing is not my style, but I do have to admit that the sheer versatility of this spell is so good that I have considered it on occasion. I think this spell works great as a utility spell. Being able to turn into any beast of lesser or equal challenge rating is even more useful than most druids' wild shape ability. You can turn into a fly and spy on enemies by literally being a fly on the wall, right? You can cross a chasm by turning into an eagle to fly across, that kind of stuff, but it really doesn't just end there. You can target an ally and then turn them into a huge gorilla or a T-Rex, which a lot of people like to do. These are not my style at all, but I've played at many tables where people have done this, and it can certainly be very, very powerful. And if that wasn't enough, you can also target an enemy and then turn them into something like a mouse or a chicken, completely taking them out of the combat and then putting them in a cage or throwing them away or throwing them in a lake or whatever. This is really fun, and I like the idea of specifically like a witch character turning creatures into small animals. That's pretty cool. Regardless, however you use this spell, it can be very versatile and very powerful. The fact that it's a utility spell that can also be a buff spell, that can also be a control spell, is amazing and a great spell for sorcerers. Spells that can serve as Swiss Army knives are fantastic for sorcerer spells, mostly because you have such few known spells. The more mileage that you can get out of one particular spell, the better, and it'll help you be a little bit more versatile as a spellcaster. This one has a range of 60 feet, which is great, and you can extend the range with Distance Spell, and this is another spell that you can basically make it immune to being counter-spelled if you do the Distance Spell Metamagic on it, because once you go past that 60-foot range, you can't be countered. So that's really cool. Sickening Radiance. Now this spell is really awesome. The damage is great at 4d10 per round, and it's radiant, my favorite damage type in the game. The range is great at 120 feet, and the area of effect is huge. It's 30-foot radius, and then on top of that you get a debuff, and a debuff that's super strong. The only thing I don't like here is the Constitution saving throw. A lot of creatures have good Constitution saves. It's not going to land as much as other spells because of it. I mean, that's just going to be a fact of life with this spell. Luckily, unlike other control spells, creatures who succeed still have to keep making saving throws every round as long as they're in the area of effect, which is awesome. This means that even creatures who succeed their saving throw may still be affected by it in future rounds, as long as they're inside that area. And then the exhaustion and the glowing debuff, they do not go away if the creature succeeds their save on a subsequent round. So if they fail their saving throw the first round, they're still exhausted and they're still glowing. So that does not go away until you lose concentration on the spell. So the exhaustion still stacks. Let's say they fail their constitution saving throw. They gain 1 level of exhaustion. They succeed their save the following round, but then the round after that, they fail again. Now they have 2 levels of exhaustion, which is really, really good. The large area of effect of this spell means that you can realistically expect a creature to have to deal with 2 rounds of it before they're able to get out, assuming that you're in an open field or something. But you can really punish your enemies even more by setting up some difficult terrain right before laying out the spell, or blocking their way out of the spell with one way or another with the obstructions and stuff. The difficult terrain combined with the large area of effect, if you use another spell to create difficult terrain, it can be devastating for anybody inside, especially if they've reached 2 levels of exhaustion where now their speed is halved. And if they're in difficult terrain, they're slowed even more. They're just going to keep getting pummeled by this thing. It is so nasty, but oh so tasty. Extended spell works on this one, but that's probably overkill, to be honest, literally overkill. Heightened spell won't really work on this, and neither will empowered spell. Distance spell is probably not going to be necessary in most instances with this one. I think quicken spell works best for this one, since you can then use your action to help ensure that you slow down the creatures that are caught inside. Maybe cast like a ray of frost to slow them down, or something else, that's going to slow them down to keep them inside the area of effect for longer. Really any other action that's going to be able to slow them down in the area, it's going to work well with this spell and quicken spell. Even though this spell doesn't scale when upcast, I think you don't really need to. It's a great spell as it is, and I highly recommend it for most sorcerers. Stoneskin. This one's a very bad spell. The only good thing about it is its duration, but even that can't save the spell, let's be honest. Resistance is generally a good thing, I think, but the concentration requirement immediately makes the spell extremely costly. But then you also need to spend 100 gold every single time that you cast it. That's just too much. So what do you get for this? You or whatever creature that you cast this on gets resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. That's it. If you use it on yourself, you're going to have to make concentration checks every time that you're hit, or you're going to lose the resistance and your 100 gold along with it. The worst part is that the resistance is just so limited. By the time you can cast this spell, you're going to be at a level where most creatures you're facing are going to have damage types of all sorts, not just bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing. If you're trying to get defensive, it's probably better to not get hit at all. So use a spell like Greater Invisibility or something like that instead of this one. If you use Twin Spell, you could target 2 allies with this, like your fighter and your paladin, and then have them go into combat with resistance. That would be pretty cool. But the cost is just so high. I mean, you're using your concentration, you're spending 100 gold. If you're twinning it, now you're talking 4 sorcery points. Doing that sounds cool, but it's honestly so costly that I don't think that you're going to be able to do that consistently. It's just too much to ask. It might be worth it in certain combats, but honestly, why would you as a sorcerer with only 8 spells known at level 7 fill up one of those valuable spell slots or spells known in order to be able to cast a spell that's going to cost you 100 gold pieces every time that you cast it, and for an effect that's really mediocre on top of that? I wouldn't even look at this more than once, unless you're a Clockwork Soul or an Aberrant Mind sorcerer, because you get a lot more spells known. So then you can afford to have a couple like spells that are going to be circumstantial, but even then, I'd probably skip the spell. Storm Sphere. This one's a great spell for a sorcerer. It deals damage when you cast it, which means you can use Empowered Spell for the initial damage. The damage is kind of low, so you probably aren't going to want to use Empowered Spell, at least not unless you upcast it. What I do like about this spell is that you deal damage when you cast it. It deals damage to creatures inside when they end their turn inside. And then you can use a bonus action each round to make a special attack and deal a little bit more damage. It also has a decent area of effect that also becomes difficult terrain. So it's an all-encompassing damage, extra damage each round, difficult terrain, so control. I mean, it seems like, you get quite a bit for your buck here. So let's go ahead and break the spell down. On your first turn, you're going to be dealing 2d6 bludgeoning damage to any creature that fails its saving throw. You can then use a bonus action on the same turn and roll an attack with advantage to any creature inside for 4d6 damage, which has the potential to roll a critical hit, especially since you're rolling with advantage if you're attacking a creature inside the sphere. They'll probably end their turn inside since it's difficult terrain, taking another 2d6 damage on that same round. So every round after that, then you can attack with the lightning bolt against a creature, still getting advantage if they're inside the sphere, and then you can have your full action to cast other spells every single turn. So you don't need to be wasting sorcery points on Quicken Spell because the lightning attack is a bonus action. When you cast this spell and you're slinging spells and shooting this lightning bolt every round and doing all this stuff, you're going to feel really powerful, and I really like that feeling that this spell gives. This is a great spell. The range is really good. The effects are fantastic. It can also help preserve spell slots because it does so much, and it lingers, and it does enough damage each round that it'll help you keep up with everybody else. Transmuted Spell works great here too. You can change the damage type. Heightened Spell works. I don't recommend it, like I said, but if you upcast this spell, then I think that it may be worth it because then you're going to be dealing more than just the initial 2d8, so that would be fine. Seeking Spell doesn't work on the spell because your attack roll doesn't happen at the moment that you cast the spell, unfortunately. And Distance Spell doesn't increase the range of the lightning that shoots out from the sphere. What Distance Spell does here is you can make the center of the sphere further out than it normally would be, which is, something that you probably are never going to need to use. I really love that this spell can be upcast and it scales so well. Each spell level above 4th increases the damage for each effect by 1d6. This doesn't seem like a lot, but as we discussed earlier, it's deceptively very well scaled. If you use a 6th level slot, for example, you're going to deal 4d6 bludgeoning when you cast this spell. You can then use a bonus action that same round for 66 lightning damage, and then each creature that ends their turn there takes an additional 46 bludgeoning. That's pretty awesome. Then on top of that, each round, you can use your bonus action to attack for 6d6 damage to a creature within 60 feet and also be able to cast a spell in the same round. But even if you cast it as a 4th level spell, this is a great mix of damage and control, and this one is a spell that I highly recommend. And finally, we have Vitriolic Sphere, a blast spell that deals acid damage. That's pretty much it. No additional effects other than some additional damage on the following turn if a creature fails their initial save. I honestly don't get why this spell exists. There's plenty of other blast spells that deal more damage and also do other things in addition to the damage. Erupting Earth, Storm Sphere, Sickening Radiance, and many others. Acid is a decent damage type, and it's seldom resisted, so that's a plus, but you can always just use Transmuted Spell on other spells if you wanted to do acid damage, so it's not that big of a deal. The area of effect and the range are equivalent to Fireball. Not better, not worse, just equivalent. And a 3rd level Fireball deals close to the same damage that this spell does. More damage if a creature succeeds their saving throw. In other words, this spell deals just a little bit more damage than a Fireball, only if a creature fails its saving throw. If they succeed, you're actually dealing much less damage than Fireball does. A success with a Fireball deals 14 damage. That's a 3rd level Fireball. Deals 14 damage versus this one that deals 11 on average. On a failure, this spell deals an average of 22 versus a fireball's 28. The following round, the spell deals an additional 12.5 average, which makes it a little bit more than fireball, but it's a round later and only if the creatures failed their initial saving throws. As you can see, the round when you cast it, whether they succeed or fail, fireball's doing more damage. Only if they fail their saving throw, then do they take an additional 12.5 damage on average, making it just a little bit more damage than fireball, but it takes an extra round for that to happen. So that's that just doesn't make any sense. And then also, Empowered Spell makes Fireball more impactful if you combine it with Empowered Spell than this spell, because re-rolling low rolls nets you much greater increase on your die rolls when the dice range is bigger. Since this spell is only a d4, it's a smaller range. So re-rolling a d4, if you roll a 2, let's say, it's probably going to net you another 2. Whereas with Fireball, if you roll a 2, you might get a 4. So Fireball is far more impactful. Plus, the extra damage that you get on the following round doesn't get advantage from Empowered Spell, unfortunately. Distance Spell works, but the range is already good, so Distance Spell, is not going to work so well. Extended Spell doesn't work, so you're not going to be able to keep the acid damage going for longer. It would be cool if you could do that, but it's just going to do the acid damage for one extra round, that's it. Just like Fireball, I'd say that Heightened Spell is probably going to be a waste here for this one. Now, I'm not saying that this is a terrible spell, but there's very little that makes this more attractive than Fireball. So why waste a 4th level spell slot for something that is almost identical to a 3rd level spell? The damage type is not enough to warrant a higher slot, and the fact that it requires a dexterity saving throw, just like Fireball, means that it's not going to land as often as some other spells. Dexterity is generally a saving throw monsters are going to be good at. At least if it required a better saving throw, then it may be worth considering, like if it went for charisma or intelligence, but I just don't see a reason for taking this spell at all. And I lied, Vitriolic Sphere was not the last spell, Wall of Fire is the last spell. And this one's a control spell with some really good damage thrown in for any creature that's foolish enough to try and get past the wall. The spell deals great damage, and it can be enough of a deterrent for creatures to stay far away from the group. The damage skill's pretty decent too, so upcasting is an option with this one. There's not much more to say here other than the fact that this spell can be used to lock down enemies. Otherwise, they're going to get punished with some pretty good damage. This one provides great control and can help your team force your enemies to rethink their tactics. And I love spells like that. Transmuted Spell is really cool with this spell, since you can make like an ice wall or a lightning wall. You can really play up the thematic flavor of that with this Transmuted Spell Metamagic. Distance Spell doesn't increase the area of effect, and the range is already really good here, so you probably aren't going to need that. Extended Spell can make it last 2 minutes instead of 1, which isn't that much more, so don't expect to use that very often. Heightened Spell works on the initial 5d8 damage, so it might be worthwhile if you're targeting a lot of foes when you first cast a spell, but otherwise I'd save that for a spell like Fireball or whatever. Overall, I would recommend this spell. It's a great spell, and I think you couldn't go wrong with that. Alright, for real though, the final spell in 4th level, it's Watery Sphere. This one's a utility spell that tries to be useful in combat, but it's really just a utility spell. Basically, up to 4 medium creatures can be restrained inside the sphere and be moved around. The purpose of the spell is to have a way to get the party over difficult or treacherous terrain. That's pretty much it. For that purpose, I think the spell is decent, but I do wish that the hovering didn't have to always be 10 feet above the ground. I wish you could hover over chasms and that kind of stuff. It would make the spell a lot more useful. The duration's actually very short for a utility spell of this type, which is really confusing from a design perspective. Clearly, extended spell can come in really handy with this, but it's just weird that they would make the duration so weird for a utility spell. In combat, you can use this to try and restrain and move targets around the battlefield, but it's limited to one large creature or 4 medium or small ones. The saving throw is dexterity too, which is not ideal. This one grants a saving throw every round to end the effect. I mean, there are just so many better ways to control creatures, even spells from this level that are much better for control than this one is. I can see in some instances where this could be useful in combat, but don't take this spell expecting it to do a whole lot of work in combat consistently. It's not my favorite utility spell, but I'm sure there's plenty of times that you're going to get some mileage out of this one. Level 4 spells are generally not talked about very often, other than Polymorph. That one's really popular. But the fact is that the good level 4 spells are generally very versatile, either serving as both damage and control and utility, or another combination of functions inside and outside of combat. I recommend having a little fun with your spell selection for 4th level spells, but also keep an eye on what kinds of uses you can get out of each one. For example, Polymorph is a great choice for utility, buffing, and debuffing. Storm Sphere is great for control and also damage over time. For 4th level, I would avoid spells that serve only one purpose, like Vitriolic Sphere. So let's go ahead and take a look at 4th level spells and see which ones I recommend and which ones I don't recommend. And that does it for today's video on 4th level sorcerer spells. What do you think about my assessment on these spells? Do you agree? Do you have different opinions than I do? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope this video was helpful. If it was, please consider clicking the like button and subscribing to the channel. As always, I'm your innkeeper at the Twisted Tentacle Inn. Check in anytime. I'll talk with you then. Alright, for real, the final spell for 4th level. it's not Wall of Fire, it's not Vitriolic Sphere. The final spell is going to be So that's unfortunate. The duration's actually very short for a utility spell. The duration's actually very short for a utility spell of this type, which is really kind of confusing. From a design perspective. Jesus Christ, face, get through it. Down there.
I love this inn so much, I just want to stay in one of your rooms. Please, please. Let me in. Let me into one of the rooms. Ka-chicoo. 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 Extra money. I heard you have the most delicious sandwiches for breakfast. And I am a police officer. So, just let me stay in one of the rooms, the warmest one. I really want to stay here. I really want it. I want a sandwich. I want a room.
Sir, the only room we have is the oven.
Then let me stay in the oven. Give me the oven. I'll pay $1 extra dollar.
You'd be cooked alive if you stay in the oven.
It's nice and warm. I don't mind being cooked alive. Give me some space in the oven. Give it to me. Give it to me. Give it to me. Give it to me.
I swear that's what happened. He asked me to put him in the oven. And even though he said he could, I guess he just couldn't stand the heat.